Okay, got it. Are we good to go?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, awesome. Well, first of all, thanks so much for inviting me to speak at this meeting. I wish I could be there in person for one reason. Where you all are is one of my favorite places on the western part of the United States. So I would have loved to have been there and meet you all in person and just talk to you about some of this stuff. But we'll do it by Zoom for now, and maybe we can meet sometime in the future. As Willard mentioned, I will be talking about how NASA uses remote sensing, so satellites basically, for ecological conservation. What I'm going to do in the next maybe 45 minutes or so is I'll talk a little bit about me and what my background is, and then I'll talk a little bit about NASA Earth Sciences, because a lot of people don't even know that NASA does Earth Science, so I always like to start off with that. And then I'm going to get a little geeky with you all, and talk a little bit about the basics of remote sensing, just so you get a feel and an understanding about how it all kind of works. I'm not going to get too technical, but I'm kind of a teacher at heart, and so I do like to teach a little bit as I give these talks. So hopefully you'll learn something from that. And then I'm going to give some examples of some of the projects that we have that I think you might be really interested in. They're kind of in, in the western part of the US. We have projects all over the globe, but I was trying to pick some that I thought would be really you would be interested in. And lastly, I want to leave you with some information, really resources that you can look into and use yourself. Everything's freely available. I like to end on that with something that, something that you can actually go back and do yourself. So I'll go ahead and get started. What do I do at NASA? So as I mentioned before, and Willard mentioned, I'm an associate program manager for the Ecological Conservation Program. I also wear a bunch of other hats, as we do at NASA. We wear many different hats. I'm also project coordinator for 2 different Conservation International projects that we have. So it's a partnership that NASA has with the big NGO Conservation International. And both of those right now, well, one's in Africa, in the African continent, and the other one is will likely be in South America. I'm also a board member for the U.S. Arctic Observation Network. I just had a big board meeting today on that, and that's really a bunch of U.S. agencies that get together to talk about the importance of providing data and information to people in the Arctic, since Arctic is kind of a canary in the coal mine in terms of climate change and a bunch of other things. And then lastly, and this is kind of a weird one, I'm an acting disaster coordinator at Ames Research Center. So I'm actually based at Ames Research Center, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area. So even though I work actually directly for NASA headquarters, which is in Washington, D.C., I live in California, and I'm based at Ames. We have a disasters program at NASA as well, and all of the different NASA centers, and they're all over the US, have these disaster coordinators. So for right now, I am also the acting disaster coordinator, which I'm anxiously trying to turn that over to some other people, because I've got just way too much other stuff going on. I also started the Indigenous Peoples Capacity Building Program about 7 years ago. I think maybe that's where Willard maybe found my name in some articles having to do with that. I'm very passionate about including Indigenous knowledge, and really weaving it together with Western science, because I really truly believe that we can solve some of our environmental crises by really working closely with Indigenous peoples. And so, 7 years ago, NASA as an agency weren't really paying much attention to tribes, particularly in the US. And I felt like we needed to pay attention to tribes, one, because they're sovereign nations, right, within our own US border. And they have a lot to contribute to what we do. So that program, even though it's been a bit of an uphill battle for a variety of reasons to get that really up and going, it is now after 7 years. And I've actually turned over leadership of that to a younger person. And also we've hired some young Native American women to work with us on that project. But I'm very, very proud of what they're doing. I've also was the lead trainer for our applied remote sensing training program for about 10 years. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that at the end, because that's the program where you could go to find all kinds of free resources about learning how to do what we do. And lastly, I taught remote sensing at local community colleges here in the Bay Area for about 12 years. So that's where the teaching part of me kind of comes in. I get really excited about really teaching about how we use satellite imagery for a lot of this stuff, and try to do it at a level that's clear and that you can really understand, hopefully. I mean, I'll be happy to answer any questions, of course, at the end if anything isn't very clear. And then the pictures on the right, our communications people at headquarters just did a story on me. It was kind of like about the program, and then a little bit about my background and some advice for young people and all of that kind of stuff. So if you do a Google on my name and that program, you'll find that video. And then I also get the opportunity to travel a lot in my job. And so that middle picture with the hard hat on there, that's me and my colleague of mine from Boise State University on a beaver project that I'll be talking about a little bit later. And then I got the amazing opportunity to meet Jane Goodall in the bottom right there at a conference in Hawaii. That was like, oh my gosh, that was an experience of a lifetime. So, I love my job. It's the best job ever. And you'll see that as I kind of go along in my presentation. Just a little background. I have a really crazy background. So I love talking to students about, getting into the environmental field, because I think some people think you have to study a specific thing and you have to follow that path. And then you'll get to where you want to be. And my story is so different than that. It's so windy and curvy, but I think the windy and curvy parts, honestly, really contribute to my body of knowledge in terms of all kinds of different things. So I actually have a bachelor's degree in environmental policy analysis and planning. I spent a couple of years in the Netherlands getting a postgraduate diploma. My background's actually mostly academically in urban planning. So I was a planner for a number of years before I got working with NASA. So I did things like zoning code enforcement officer in Sacramento County. That was like my first job out of college, and an assistant planner in Saratoga. And then I kind of got working with NASA a little bit, and got really excited about remote sensing and satellite imagery and how you just get a different perspective of the world. I thought that was the coolest thing ever. And so in addition to working at NASA, I had some other jobs where I was a vegetation mapping specialist with CAL FIRE for a couple of years. And then I worked as a remote sensing manager for a private consulting firm, Pacific Meridian Resources, for a couple of years. So I've kind of been around and done a whole bunch of things, and loved every minute of it. I wouldn't trade any of it. So this is just some personal stuff on me. I have 2 daughters and a husband, as well as a dog and a cat and a chicken and some unknown number of reptiles. My daughter, who's 24, is living at home with us right now. She's applying for medical schools, and she's really into reptiles. And so she's got them in her room. I don't know how many are in there. I don't want to know. I love reptiles, but I don't like them in captivity. So I just sort of stay away from that. Hobbies, I like to do all kinds of stuff. Travel, we travel a lot. Biking, hiking, I like to weave. I'm a weaver. I like to bead. I like to make my own soap. And I'm going to retire in March 2025. So a year and some change, because I got a whole lot of other stuff I want to be doing. And then these are some pictures on the bottom of a trip actually 2 trips that my husband and I took to South Africa and Botswana this year. And it was, believe it or not, was for work. But my husband came along and we spent a few days that wasn't work, doing some safaris and things like that. So that was a pretty spectacular trip. So I threw in some pictures from that. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about NASA Earth science, because like I said before, a lot of people don't even know that NASA does Earth science. It's funny because my husband also works for NASA and he works on the planetary science side of things. And it's kind of what we call the real NASA. And Earth science is maybe not as well known, but in my mind, equally as important as the planetary and space stuff that we do. So, the really important thing for you to know about this is we have a lot of satellites in space, and you can see them kind of spinning around the Earth in different orbits and things like that. But what we really do is we take all of that data and we turn it into information that's useful, whether it's research or whether it's people that can actually use it to make decisions on the ground. And that's key to what we do. And you can see we've got probably around 19 Earth observing satellites right now that observe the atmosphere, the oceans, and the terrestrial ecosystems. So all 3 of those things. And so each of these satellites kind of are for a different purpose. And then we have several sensors that are also on the International Space Station. And those are shorter duration sensors, but they're kind of like, in some ways, experimental. So we put them on the space station for a couple years, and then if they do a really great job and they're really used a lot, the data are really used a lot, then NASA says, okay, we should be launching something in space that's a longer duration to do some of these things that's going on the space station. So the space station has been super valuable for us in terms of developing these satellites. Okay, next slide. All right, so within our Earth Science program, and again, this is all run out of NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., we have these different sort of categories: the technology, the flight. The flight is, we have both satellites and airborne, and UAVs, actually. We have a lot of drones as well. We have a large RNA program, research and analysis program. And of course, to do all of this stuff, we need to have really excellent ability to compute these data, right? So we have supercomputers at various NASA centers that can help us process some of these data. And lastly, the thing that's near and dear to my heart is applications. So how do we take all of this data and this amazing work that's done through our RNA programs and actually use it on the ground for making decisions? And so it's kind of bringing the people, right? The people into this, as opposed to just doing kind of the hardcore science. So that I'll talk a little bit more about applications. So this year, we're seeing some pretty big changes in our applications program. First of all, we're changing our name from applications to Earth Action. Because now the folks at NASA headquarters really wanted to reflect the fact that, we're trying to develop products and tools and things like that to actually inform decisions on the ground. So sort of the action piece of that. So within Earth Action, our applications program, we have all of these different sub-programs, capacity building, eco forecasting, which is actually now my program, ecological conservation. We've renamed that as well. Health and air quality, agriculture. You can see all of these different programs. And so I could easily talk an hour on any one of these things because they're all doing such amazing things. But since I'm an associate program manager for eco conservation, that's what we'll be talking to here. And you're all plant people, which is so awesome because I can talk plants, which I will do. So we'll get to that in a minute. So I did want to touch on our capacity building program, which is now being called community engagement because it's getting a lot bigger than just building the capacity of people to use this technology. On the far left, we have our remote sensing training programs called RSET, which I'll talk about later. We have an internship program that is just amazing, and it's called Develop. So if you know any students, actually, to be honest with you, anybody over 18 can apply to that internship program. You could be in a career change. You could be in the field, but you want to get more hands-on experience, whatever it is, you can apply for that program. So it actually isn't just for students. We have Servier, which is our international capacity building program. So that's a collaborative between NASA and USAID. And so they work in a whole bunch of different countries. We have our Indigenous Peoples Initiative. So that's the one that I started 7 years ago. And that's really going quite strong now in sort of building the capacity of Indigenous peoples to use this technology for natural and cultural resource management. We have a new program, Equity and Environmental Justice, which is really interesting for us. I think we've struggled a little bit as to how EEJ will kind of fit into the NASA framework. And so that's, we're kind of watching that program to see where it goes, but I'm really excited. Again, it's bringing the people into this, right? And looking at like disaster risk and resilience and the equity across that. So there's some really interesting things happening with that as well. And then we have this whole group of folks that are working on prizes and challenges. So there's a lot of sort of hackathons that happen and things like that, that anyone can participate in to contribute to sort of the body of knowledge about how to use satellite imagery for any of these topics that I'm mentioning. So I'm going to start drilling down a little bit more into our programs having to do with biodiversity and ecological conservation. So we have two programs. Our biological diversity program is really on the RNA side, and it's using satellite imagery and other kinds of aircraft imagery and things like that to really understand biodiversity among living organisms. And so it's more on the research side, and then the application side that I'm talking about, where we're really looking at decision making and how this stuff could be used for decision making, is our ecological conservation program. And so the two program managers are amazing people. And so if you really wanted to talk more about any of these and more specifics, they would welcome your calls. Woody and Keith are good friends of mine, and they're my NASA bosses, and I adore working with them. It's just, we have a really nice team. There's several others, a couple other associate program managers that I work with. And we're just really passionate, I would say, about the work that we do in this program. So I want to get a little bit into a remote sensing 101, because the reason I'm doing this is so you get a better understanding of how this satellite imagery stuff works. And also, more specifically, we're going to be talking about plants. And so what can we see with these satellites, and plants, and beyond, just an image that you're seeing on Google Earth or something like that? What do we do with that? So I do want to kind of get into that a little bit, hopefully not getting too technical, but just enough so you get an idea for how this all sort of works. So what is remote sensing? I've been talking about remote sensing a lot, satellite imagery, all of that kind of stuff. But remote sensing is pretty straightforward. It really is obtaining information about an object from a distance. So a camera is a remote sensing, it's a way to do remote sensing. And there's different information you need to know about whatever the thing is you want to study. So you need to know what exactly you need to collect, and you need to know how much detail you need. And then you need to know also how often do you need those data. So this is all information we can find out from the various sensors that we have aboard these satellites. So what is the benefit of using remote sensing data and satellite imagery in particular? So it really allows for looking at things, large areas, and it allows you to look at things very consistently. So if you have the same image of an area over time, that's a very consistent measurement. You can compare the imagery with ground observations. And as a matter of fact, when I teach my remote sensing courses, I always tell my students, I say, you can sit in front of your computer and you can, analyze, and you can do some interesting things with satellite images to turn it, from that data into information that I mentioned earlier. But in order to truly understand what's going on in that image, you need to go on the ground. You need to go on the ground and you need to see what it is that you're looking at in that satellite image. I think that some people think that the imagery can replace going on the ground, but it cannot. It cannot. You have to go on the ground to understand, what it is that you're seeing in that image. However, you can't go on the ground everywhere, right? You can pick certain places you can go to. There are some places that are just really hard to get to. They're very remote. They're hard to access. And that's, again, where the satellite imagery can really help benefit understanding what's going on in these very remote areas. And then again, as I mentioned before, the satellite imagery, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail in a sec, is that you get this time series of data that goes back till, at least the 80s and sometimes before that, depending on the imagery. So you can get this amazing look at an area and how it's changed over time by just doing some quick analyses. So it's quite powerful. And hopefully that like resonates with you a little bit. Okay, so now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty a little bit of how the satellite imagery actually works. It's really funny. Again, when I teach this class, I kind of refer to physics, physics classes that you may have taken a long time ago. And people start, like, their eyes start kind of rolling to the back of their head. And, they start sort of shaking uncontrollably when I say that. But it's really it's really the basics of physics. I did terrible in physics when I was in college. So the fact that I'm actually teaching this stuff now, I'm like thinking, okay, I can teach this to anybody. So the important thing to remember, honestly, about working with satellite imagery is that that solar energy comes from the sun in these different wavelengths, and we call that electromagnetic radiation. And then that radiation, once it hits the Earth, it's either reflected or it's absorbed or it's emitted by the Earth's atmosphere or surface. So those are the three things that you just have to remember. So we're going to talk about the spectrum a little bit, the electromagnetic spectrum. So these are the wavelengths, right, of the energy that's coming from the sun. So we have longer wavelengths on the left-hand side, and you can see on the diagram there, it says radio wave. So those are very long wavelengths. And then as the wavelengths get shorter, as you go to the right, you know, the shorter ones are those gamma waves all the way on the right-hand side. So the two things that you need to know about this is the first thing is that visible light. So this is what we see with our eyes. This is the only thing we can only see visible light with our eyes, is a very, very narrow part of that spectrum. So you can see that visible light coming down, and it's just a teeny little, you know, sliver really in the whole spectrum. And what the satellites can do, they can actually, I call it see, they can see beyond what we can see with our eyes. And that's the key to this whole thing. So the satellites typically will observe in the infrared part of the spectrum and sometimes into the microwave, depending on the satellite and the sensor. And the reason that's important is because it enables the satellites to sort of detect things that we can't even see with our eyes. That's what's important. And for vegetation, I'll explain that in a little bit. That's really super important because you can see things about vegetation with the satellites, things like declining health, or other things like that are really affecting the chlorophyll in the leaves. You can actually detect that with the satellites before you can actually see it with your eyes because of that. So hopefully that makes some sense. So as I just said, the energy from the sun comes in different wavelengths and it hits different surfaces, and it does different things, right, with different surfaces. So we'll talk about vegetation because you all are all plant people. And vegetation is actually one of the easiest things to detect with satellite imagery because it has a very, very distinct characteristic. So what vegetation does is absorbs blue and red wavelengths. And then that energy is used by chlorophyll for photosynthesis, but it reflects green and infrared. So that's why we see healthy vegetation as green, is because it's reflecting that energy. And we can't see infrared, right? If we had infrared glasses that we put on and we looked at vegetation, it would look very bright. So vegetation reflects infrared like a ton, way, way, way more than it reflects green. So the way a satellite looks at it, it will look at vegetation in the infrared, and vegetation will like light up the screen because it's so bright. And that's very unique for vegetation. And we use that to our advantage to look at different vegetation types, to look at vegetation areas that have been disturbed or burned or something like that. So this is a really important characteristic of vegetation. So I want to talk a little bit about different characteristics of the imagery itself. Some of this you've probably heard of before, like spatial resolution. So basically, you know, the images are made up of pixels, right? And each pixel covers a particular area on the ground. And so the picture that you're seeing here is you're seeing imagery that have pixels of 1 meter, 10 meters, and 30 meters. And of course, as you go up in spatial resolution, as you increase that number, then the blurrier and kind of pixelier it's going to get, right? So it's really important to understand, you know, what the spatial resolution is of the imagery that you're looking at. And I'll talk a little bit more specifically about the spatial resolution of the imagery that we use, which is typically quite coarse. And there's kind of a reason for that. The other resolution I want to talk about is temporal resolution. So that is simply how many times does a satellite cross over the same place on the Earth? And it really varies from sensor to sensor. Some satellites pass over the Earth every like twice a month. So something like Landsat, you may have heard of Landsat imagery before that. So that's twice a month. But then we have other satellites that will collect data over the same place like every day or sometimes twice a day. So, really understanding how often what that temporal resolution is really important in doing some of these studies. For example, if you need to know some process that happens within a month. So a lot of people that work in agriculture, for example, once a month is not enough for them. They need more information than that. They need twice or 3 or 4 times a month to get really, good information about their crops. Whereas if you're looking in a temperate forest, a non-disturbed temperate forest, there's not going to be a lot of change really over time. So, once a year or something like that, or looking at once every 5 years, what's happening in that temperate forest may be more relevant. The last thing, which is a little bit harder for folks to kind of wrap their head around, is called spectral resolution. So that really describes the ability of a sensor to measure information in the different wavelengths that I was talking about. So if we look at the graphs right now, so the top graph on the x-axis, you have wavelengths. So remember, I showed you that electromagnetic spectrum that went from short wavelengths to long wavelengths. So that's what this is. Essentially, you're going from short wavelengths to long wavelengths. And then on the y-axis is really kind of the what's called the atmospheric transmission. So how much light or how much of this wavelength is the atmosphere actually let through? Usually there's a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere, and so it blocks some of those wavelengths coming through. And so we want to design sensors in areas where you don't have that blockage, unless you're interested in looking at what's going on in the atmosphere. And then some of those sensors actually will be designed to look at what's going on in the atmosphere. So the big thing that I want you to take home from this particular image or this particular slide is the idea of multispectral versus hyperspectral. And this will become important when I start talking about plant species. So multispectral means that an image, if you look at the wavelengths on that top graph, those numbers that you see in there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, those are layers of data that a satellite provides. And the width of those bars that you see, so like if we're looking at number at 5 or 7 or something like that, is quite wide. And so that particular layer, that layer 5, covers a lot of wavelengths, for example. So they cover really a broad spectrum of wavelengths, and that's called multispectral. So something like Landsat, for example, has around 7 to 11 bands of information or bands or layers of information that correspond to each of these different wavelength types. So that's called multispectral because there's only, 7 to 11 bands that cover all of these different wavelengths. The next sort of generation of satellites are going to be hyperspectral. So what hyperspectral means is that rather than having these really big blocks, you're going to have very, very, very narrow strips. So you have basically an image or a layer covering a very, very narrow part of that wavelength spectrum. And so you end up with, rather than 7 or 11 layers, you have 256 layers covering, everything from the visible often to the mid-infrared part of the spectrum. That's a lot of data. And I'll explain why this is important, particularly for plants, in just a second. So the big question you might be asking is, can you detect plant species from space? And the answer is, it depends. It really depends. So with that multispectral imagery, so like the Landsat imagery that I just mentioned, you can generally detect broad categories of plants or of groups of plants. So like conifer, deciduous, chaparral, shrubland, that kind of thing. Because Landsat has a spatial resolution of 30 meters. And so 30 meters, if you think about it, is about the size of like a baseball diamond. So it's quite large. So basically everything in that pixel is going to get averaged. And plus it's multispectral, not hyperspectral. And so you just don't have the level of detail that you would with, higher spatial resolution or higher spectral resolution. So, people have tried really hard to get at very specific plant species identification using Landsat imagery, but it's quite difficult. And so depending on what the use is, and this example right here is a map that NASA and Conservation International worked on together to create this ecosystem extent map for Liberia. For the country of Liberia. So you can see it might be a little hard to read that, but essentially it's sort of like montane grassland, lowland grassland, moderately degraded tropical lowland rainforest. I mean, so they're quite broad categories that you can get with the Landsat imagery. And then one additional thing that I didn't mention before about like the imagery that we provide, that NASA does, we do not provide very high spatial resolution imagery. And the reason for that is because the commercial sector, so there's companies like Planet and Maxar. So all of this stuff that you're seeing on the news that's really high spatial resolution, looking at conflict areas and all of that, those are from commercial companies. And so NASA is legally cannot compete with those commercial companies. So we cannot, from an application standpoint in particular, from a research standpoint, there are some aircraft that can get very high spatial resolution, imagery, but it's for research only. And so that's why a lot of the stuff that we do is quite general and broad, like you're seeing here. So the next, just adding on to that, let's go back to the hyperspectral imagery. And right now we do not have a satellite that is hyperspectral imagery. That's coming in the future. But we do have a lot of aircraft that have sensors on them that have these hyperspectral imagers on them. And with those kinds of imagers, you can get down to species level. And not only can you get down to species level, but you can detect like plant chemicals, like chlorophyll, lignin. You can extrapolate data sort of more broadly at a landscape scale, looking at things that canopy nitrogen and water content. You can, again, get at specific species, so you can look at the biodiversity of an area. And then when you combine it with things like LiDAR imagery, which really looks at sort of the structure of vegetation, it can help detect taxonomic, phylogenetic, as well as functional biodiversity. So it's all research right now. We've got some amazing scientists that are doing work in this area. And it's all preparing for this launch that we're going to have. It's still a ways down the road, but NASA is kind of going all in with hyperspectral imagery, because it's kind of the next step, right? It's the next it's getting that additional information that we just can't get out of the Landsats of the world. And so we're kind of gearing up for teaching people about how to use hyperspectral imagery. Even I am no expert in hyperspectral because it takes a whole different level of processing to get the information out. It's very, very noisy data. And so I do not claim any expertise in this particular, in working with hyperspectral data. So now, that's it for Remote Sensing 101. I hope that, you learned a little something from that, and that it wasn't too, it wasn't too difficult to follow. I'm happy to answer any questions at the end, of course, about any questions you might have about that specific topic. But what I do want to talk to you a little bit about is some of the project examples that we have going on with our ecological conservation program that I think you might be interested in. The first one is a project that is called Yukon to Yellowstone. So it doesn't specifically impact the state of Oregon. However, the tools that they're developing it certainly does. And so this is based on something called MoveBank, which this organization designed. It's basically, I'll go to the next page. It's basically a repository for animal movement data. So anyone, anywhere can upload their animal movement data to this repository. And then you can decide if you want to keep it private or not, because there's a lot of species out there where you don't want people to know where they are exactly. This particular example that I'm showing here are turkey vultures. Actually, somebody did a study on the migration of turkey vultures. And so I just kind of visualized it here. So you can visualize data. And this is strictly just the animal movement data. And then what they're doing in addition to that is adding the capability to bring in the environmental data and then do some modeling with that, and some comparisons of what's going on the ground with the environmental conditions as animals are moving over space and time. And so that is called MoveApps. And so MoveApps is currently in development by the same team that has developed MoveBank. And it's super exciting because this is going to allow, natural resource managers, wildlife experts, all of these folks to really start looking at what's going on with animal movement over very large scales, and then again compare that to the environmental data. So that's happening right now. They're about midway through their project, and so they've got another couple years yet to fully develop MoveApps. The other project I wanted to tell you about is one of my favorites. I love this project. So it's about beaver rewilding. And so the PI for this is at Boise State University. And what she's doing is a bunch of different things. She's using remote sensing, satellite imagery, to look at potentially likely good places to reintroduce beaver. So she's working closely with some folks from Utah State, and they do the beaver relocation. So they actually move beaver into areas that, of course, have been, they've talked with the landowners and done all this stuff to really try to restore the area. And so it's really exciting. And then once a beaver is established, the beaver are established in an area, then you can use the satellite imagery to look at how that area changes over time, right? How it's improving. And so it's really about making these riparian and mesic ecosystems more resilient to human-induced and climate changes. And it's kind of trying to also overcome that idea that beavers are bad. I got the opportunity to go out to a large ranch in northern Utah where that rancher had actually brought beaver back to his land, and the changes on his property were incredible. I mean, he had water flowing more longer parts of the year. It had originally was stopping in May, and now he's got water flow through August. He's got increased fish populations. The conifers are no longer encroaching into the meadows. They're all kind of dying off because they're too wet. I mean, there's all kinds of amazing impacts. So this project is super awesome. If you want more information about this particular project, one of our comms team did a great story on this, and then there's a video also associated with this particular project. So I love this project. It's just been so fun to work with these folks. The other thing that might be of interest to you is this one's finished already. So this app is actually available, but it's using satellite remote sensing to look at large-scale conservation on BLM lands. So BLM does these assessment, inventory, and monitoring on the lands, and they have specific variables in order to do that. So they're really trying to look at where those areas are degrading, where they might need to do some restoration, all of that kind of stuff. And so this project, led by Dr. Oken at UCLA, developed some methodology and some tools to be able to use satellite imagery to look at the changes in these areas over time. And they did it by sorry, the dog's barking in the background. I don't know what she's what's going on with her. Jeez. Okay. Sorry. The joys of doing these at home, right? Oh my gosh. So anyways, they've developed this app that the BLM can use to look at these variables over time. So in the past, what the BLM has done is basically go on the ground, and they've tried to, they have these plots that they go out and they look at, and they try to estimate what's going on across the larger landscape over time by looking at these plots. But this satellite imagery allows them to look at things over this sort of continuous landscape. And then this project it's also finished now, but this was a really cool project because it used these night lights data that NASA has to really look at the combination of areas that have high noise and a lot of light, anthropogenic light, and combining those. This was really done for the National Park Service, but they did it for the whole lower 48 of the US, and really identify those areas that could result in changes in behavior in particular animals. And they actually found that that the deer and the cougar have actually changed their behavior based on the existence of nightlights and sound. And so they found that the deer show a preference for areas with relatively high light levels, but that lighting did not deter cougars from hunting those deer. So that the cougars almost know that the deer will go into the light, and they'll kind of hover on the edge where the dark is. Then they'll shoot out and grab the deer and then bring them back into the dark areas. So they actually use that dark and the light as hunting strategies. So this was a really cool, interesting project. And the idea was, again, the Park Service was the kind of the main stakeholder for this particular project, because they were interested in understanding where they could maybe change some of the lights that the road network lights, or lights that are at in buildings where they have some structures and things like that, and how was that actually affecting animal behavior. So this is a product that's available to anybody, and I can give you, I guess I didn't put the website in here, but I can get that for you. I do want to talk a little bit about this project, with the Yurok tribe. We've been working more and more with them for a variety of in a variety of different ways, because they're just an amazing tribe. I mean, they're just kind of light years ahead of a lot of tribes, actually a lot of organizations, in terms of doing things like looking at carbon offsets, for example. And so this particular project, which hasn't started yet, so they just got funding to start this year, or starting in 2024. So it'll probably start in the January timeframe, to use satellite imagery to assess their minimum baseline levels of carbon in various forest parcels. And that's in order, at least with California Air Resources Board has these requirements, these offset regulations, and they have to have these baseline carbon measurements in order to get these carbon offsets. And so the tribe is working with Dr. Wood from MIT to develop a tool to be able to do this. And so you can see some of the questions that they want to answer, having to do with burns in the region, which forest parcels would the Yurok from the original ancestral territory would be advantageous to reacquire. And then, of course, what is the estimated carbon storage potential for any forest parcel? So that project will start, again, like I said, in January timeframe, and it'll last for about 4 years. So stay tuned for more on that one. One of the last ones I wanted to mention is this Bioscape project. So since you are all plant people, the area around Cape Town in South Africa is phenomenal. It is one of the highest biodiverse regions in the world. And what NASA thought is they kind of said, well, you know, if we can study biodiversity around Cape Town, in and around Cape Town, we can study biodiversity anywhere. So this year, it's going on right now as we speak. I just got back from South Africa a few weeks ago, and they've got about, 14 or 15 different science teams there right now collecting data on the ground. And then NASA sent 2 aircraft, these Gulfstreams, that are fitted with specific sensors, mostly hyperspectral, as I mentioned before, because that's where you're really going to get at identifying biodiversity, as well as some LiDAR data as well, so you can get at the structure of those plants. And they're flying that right now. And so that will go on through the end of this month. And then after that, everyone is going to kind of look at their data, do some analysis, and then see how well they did in terms of being able to look at all of these various aspects of biodiversity in this really amazing region. So you can see the specifics of that there, 9,000 plant species, 65% are endemic. I mean, it's really an incredible area. So again, NASA, the reason why we choose this, it's like, if we can do it here, we can do it anywhere, which leads me to kind of what was going to happen in the future. So NASA is starting this new program called Catalyst, and it will actually start on the West Coast, really in California, but it's going to spread beyond California after the first initial few years. But it's really, the goal is to catalyze and integrate biodiversity efforts across the state in these large areas. And, you all know, I don't even need to tell you why this is important, why it is to really understand and collect this information from the ground at all different scales, right? From the ground to satellites, to drones, to aircraft. And, so many people are doing so many amazing things in this area. And it's really kind of trying to bring all of that together and take a look at it. And also at the same time, build the capacity of people to learn how to use hyperspectral data to do this from, aircraft or from space. And so let's see, the starting place is in California. And that's just because this state is incredibly diverse. There are different parts of it that can kind of represent different parts of the world, really. But as you can see, there are other states on there, including yours, Oregon, right? So as soon as we get things sort of established in Oregon, or in California, the plan is to expand this effort into Oregon, Nevada, and Arizona. The idea is to be able to develop these tools to do them in one area, but then be able to scale them to other areas. That's the plan anyway. And, the capability that we have across the Western United States is unbelievable. I mean, the resources, I think that all of the work that you all are doing on the ground would be incredibly important to this effort. So please stay tuned for what's going to come in the future with this particular effort. Again, it'll start in California, but then it will expand beyond California in the next several years. And hopefully you all will get to be a part of all of this. Okay, so lastly, I just want to leave you with these resources that are freely available to you. And I'm going to just go back and refer to our Applied Remote Sensing Training Program, RSET. And what that program does is provide these webinars. And they're freely available on any of these topics, any and all of them. And at all different levels. Some are just awareness. So if you want to know more about what NASA does in agriculture or water resources, and then you can go to RSAT and look at the very sort of introduction or these sort of high-level descriptions of what we do in these areas. But in addition to that, the really cool thing about RSAT is not only do they do these what I call awareness webinars, but they also do almost like MOOCs, where they have more advanced webinars where you could even learn how to do some coding or some image processing using some freely available software, that kind of stuff. So if you're real geeky about this, like I am, you can really learn how to do some of this stuff that yourself if you're interested. I mean, this is just the coolest resource ever. And then this is just an example of some of the things that they offer. You can learn about the fundamentals of remote sensing, or there's one that was done more recently for this Bioscape project, the biodiversity applications for airborne imaging systems. And that particular one is not it's not a really high level. It's very high overview. So that might be of interest to you as well. So that's it. Hopefully that's a lot of information in a very short period of time. Hopefully you got a lot out of that. I did want to leave you with a couple websites here. I will make these slides available to anybody that wants them for sure. But our applied sciences website in ecological conservation is that top one. And then our biodiversity program is that bottom one that also includes a lot of ecological conservation information. And then my email address is there as well. And please feel free to contact me anytime. I love talking to people about this stuff. And I welcome any and all questions. So at that point, I think I will stop. Can't see the chat right now, but I'm happy to take any questions that anybody might have.
Thanks, Cindy. Let me see if I can get the comments up. Hold on.
If she could stop her share, I think we can kind of.
Do you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, if you could.
Yeah, no problem.
One question is, can you speak a little bit more about why NASA is blocked from certain levels of data that commercial operations are allowed to have?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it's just a legal thing, honestly. Um, eh, Back when the commercial satellites were just starting to get sort of off the ground, um, I would say that it's like a lobby group really lobbied Congress to make sure that NASA wasn't going to build similar satellites, high spatial resolution satellites. And so they created these laws. And so again, legally, we cannot compete with the commercial sector. And that's what it comes down to, is that, the Congress just said, you government people, and because we provide everything for free, we don't charge anything for our data at all. Everything is freely available. And so, of course, if we were to provide high spatial resolution imagery, we could that would put these commercial folks out of business, right? So we just can't compete with them. So they are in the process. They build these commercial satellites, very, very high spatial resolution, and that is their job. And they have a business model around that, and that's how they make their money. So that's really the reason. People ask us that all the time because it's like, but honestly, the best we can do is around 30 meters. There are a few satellites, like the Europeans actually have a very similar satellite to ours. That gets down to 15 meters. But again, that's about the best we're going to do from any government agency.
Excellent. Are there any questions in the room? Yeah.
About LiDAR and when that is.
Can you speak a little bit about LiDAR and how you're using that?
Yeah.
Or what it is?
Okay, so what it is, so LiDAR is it's what we call an active sensor. So LiDAR is I wish I had a diagram of it, but essentially how sensors like Landsat I was talking about, they use reflected energy from the sun, right? That electromagnetic energy. LiDAR and radar is also very similar, use their own energy. So they pulse energy down to the earth, and it bounces off the earth and other objects. And then it enables you to look at features on the earth in a much different way than looking at things like in a picture, like a Landsat image. So LiDAR enables you, since it can hit the earth, but it can also hit like the top of canopy, it can hit understory, it can actually penetrate canopy and get understory. So what you end up getting with LiDAR is vertical structure of vegetation. You can also get topography. If you wipe the vegetation off an area, you can actually get it topography as well. But from a vegetation standpoint, we use it for looking at vertical structure, because you can get information about each sort of level of layer of vegetation within any particular area. It's super valuable for us, because if you get at structure, you can get at information about that area that you can't get from just looking at a satellite and the top of a canopy, for example, right? You can't penetrate that canopy with something like Landsat, but with LiDAR you can. And so we have one LiDAR that's in space right now. Actually, we have two. One LiDAR is on the space station. It's called JEDI. It's fun. It's GEDI. It's posting, so that the posting is basically how far apart those beams hit the earth. It's pretty far. They're like 25 meters apart. So when you're looking at global vegetation structure, it's quite good. If you're looking at a very small area, it's not going to be very useful, the stuff from the space station. So what a lot of people do is they'll fly LiDAR. And when you fly it in an aircraft, you can get way more detailed information about plant structure or, you know, other kinds of things about structure on the ground, topography and things like that. So most people fly LiDAR. It's a little expensive, but like the tribe, Yurok tribe, they have their own LiDAR. They actually started their own company in flying LiDAR data. So, and I think the state of California is planning on flying wall-to-wall LiDAR for the state. I'm not sure what's in Oregon, what the extent of LiDAR data is, but the USGS is also a big provider of LiDAR data. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. Any other questions from the room?
I have a few.
Okay.
Hi, Cindy, that was really interesting. I have a few questions. So I'm glad somebody asked that about the non-compete clause.
Yes. Yeah.
Is NASA actually developing some of those things, or is it private industry that's developing it?
Yeah, it's mostly private industry.
Okay.
That's doing that, you know, the high spatial resolution stuff. That's, you know, NASA's
Okay.
not. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I was just
Yeah.
wondering, I know sometimes, you know, the space program or something develops the technology and then it goes out into the commercial world and is
Yeah, no, in this case,
scaled.
yeah, in this case, I think the technology is known well enough that the private firms actually are developing their own technology there. I mean, it originated from NASA, I would say, because we go back, you know, to the 60s and doing some of this stuff, right? But you know, the commercial sector it's been super challenging for them, for sure, to figure out a good business model. But they do develop their own stuff. We do work with them. So we have like a data buy that we have an agreement with them. So if you're a researcher working funded by NASA, you actually have access to those data, to those high spatial resolution data. It's just that we can't provide that data to stakeholders that might want to use it, you know, natural resource managers or something like that.
So kind of going into the hyperspectral,
Yeah.
Will that be similar? Will that then be developed? I mean, that's just a side question. It's not what my real question was, but I was wondering about that. Is that
Yeah, it's a
go
great
that
question.
route?
So I think hyperspectral is tough. It's a lot more expensive to produce.
For
And
now.
yeah, right, exactly. And so NASA is really taking, and other space agencies, there's a lot of space agencies out there doing similar kinds of things, not just NASA, but NASA is definitely taking a lead on developing those hyperspectral sensors. We're using aircraft right now because, again, we don't have the satellites. But my guess is that once the satellites get up there and people really start using those data, you know, frequently, then the commercial sector will come in and say, oh, you know, try to find their niche in that, you know, in that place. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens in the future with hyperspectral.
Right. That sounds fascinating. So you said it's so dense. Will AI be used in part of the interpretation of
That's such a
imagery?
great question. Yes, absolutely. So a lot of times the researchers use machine learning. So it's basically kind of the same thing. You know, AI takes it to a whole nother level. But they use machine learning techniques to really get at trying to pull that information out of that hyperspectral data, because it is crazy stuff to work with. So yeah.
And then I also had a question about the move bank and the tracking of the animals. Are those only kind of collared or tagged animals that are being tracked in that imagery?
Most of the time, I think they mostly are collared or tagged. They, you know, but they do birds. I mean, there's like
The
right,
Cornell migration maps.
exactly. Right. So they, you know, some of it just depends. I mean, the researchers come from all over the place and they collect their data in various ways. Some actually use citizen science approaches to do that. So it's just simply observation. A lot of the more, I would say, in-depth studies are collaring animals or putting radio, you know, those radio things on the back of birds and things like that. So I think it's a variety of things.
Okay. I was wondering with those maps, depending on how they were tracking maps, it seems like that could be used almost like flood maps, sort of for development to inform sort of development or zoning or things like that. I know we have lots of, yeah.
Exactly. I mean, the big thing now is actually ecosystem services and really trying to understand the service that the ecosystem provides to a particular area. Nature-based solutions is another big term that's, starting to bubble up quite a bit. And so what those maps do is really, it's one layer of information and in a whole bunch of information that can provide decision-making information about, again, ecosystem services, or other things that are important to a particular region. So yes, I mean, that's what they typically use those maps for.
Okay. And I think we got one more question in the chat here. Oops. Let's see. Oh, a couple more maybe. How does all this NASA information interface with the military? Does the military have its own systems? Yeah.
The military, I call it the dark side. Yeah, the dark side, they have their own systems, absolutely. And they're very high. I mean, there's stuff I'm sure that we don't even know about, but all our stuff is publicly available. So like I don't need security clearances or anything like that. There are people that I work with that actually do work with the military fairly, reasonably, but they have it's a whole different ball game, that group, the dark side.
The dark side, I like that. Yeah. And then there was one more question in there. You just said, has any of this ever been used to discover an invasive population of invasive plants that no one has found yet?
That's such a great question. The only thing that comes to mind, not for invasive plant species, but you know what? I think that's what's going to happen. Like in this Bioscape project,
right.
With the sort of the emergence of the hyperspectral data, right. I think those are the kinds of things that we're going to start to see. It's going to be like, oh, what the heck is that, right? But I do have to tell you, there was one project. It didn't have to do with plants. It had to do with penguins. And we had a project, this woman was using Landsat imagery to identify penguin populations in the Antarctic. And you can do that with certain penguins because they basically poop on the rocks. And you can't see the penguins from space, but you can see their guano, believe it or not, on the rocks.
Phosphorus or something, huh?
And yeah, exactly. I mean, they eat krill and, other things. So it reflects in a particular way. And they discovered a whole mega population of penguins that they didn't even know exist in the Antarctic. Story. Yeah, right. Which is right.
Likewise, awesome. Like rare plants that we see somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. More than we thought.
Right. And we'll be seeing those rare plants and the invasive species, I think, more and more with these new, data systems that we're launching into space. So hopefully, we'll get rid of those buggers. And it's a really big issue actually in the Cape Town area, really big issue, invasive species. Yeah. So they're trying to develop those algorithms to really get at some of that information.
Okay. Any final questions from the room here? All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to move on to meeting a plan. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. And I'm glad technology worked.
Yeah, exactly. We'll look into some of those tools. I'm sure I saw people taking pictures of this screen. And
excellent.
Stuff. And we'll post this recording as well.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Cindy. And thanks, Willard, for arranging. This was wonderful. And thanks for backing us up. I'm going to close the Zoom.
Okay. Have a great evening.
Okay. Bye-bye.